Hey there. So the podcast is currently on an extended hiatus so that I can write my next book and work on some other exciting projects. But while we're away, I hope you'll enjoy this fan favorite episode from the archives. If you want brand new content to help you make peace with food and heal from diet culture, come sign up for my free weekly newsletter at christyharrison.com/newsletter, where I answer a weekly listener question. And as always, if you join my Intuitive Eating Fundamentals course at christyharrison.com/course, you get access to our exclusive monthly Q&A podcast where I answer all your new questions. Just go to christyharrison.com/newsletter and christyharrison.com/course to sign up, or click the links in the episode description. Welcome to Food Psych, a podcast about intuitive eating, health at every size, body liberation, and taking down diet culture. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and I'm an anti-diet registered dietitian, certified intuitive eating counselor, and author of the book Anti-Diet: Reclaim Your Time, Money, Well-Being, and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating, which is available wherever books are sold. Join me here every week as I interview interesting people from all different backgrounds about their paths toward peace with food in their bodies. And by the way, on this show, we bleep out diet culture stuff like weight and calorie numbers, but we don't censor swear words or other adult language, so listener discretion is advised.
Anti-diet revolution, we're for health at every size. Eat the foods you like. Food Psych.
Hey there, welcome to episode 175 of Food Psych. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and today I'm talking with Marci Evans, a food and body image healer and a good friend of mine who's back for her second episode on the podcast. For her first appearance in episode 80, we tackled the topic of so-called food addiction, and this time we dove deep into another important topic, the intersection of digestive disorders and eating disorders, including the risks associated with elimination diets, the role of the gut microbiome in digestion and health, the importance of consistency in self-care and well-being, and so much more. It's a really great one. I think this is going to be a fan favorite, and I can't wait to share our conversation with you in just a moment. But first, I'll answer this week's listener question. It's from a listener named Lori who writes, "Hi, Christy. I'm a fellow eating disorder dietitian, and I'll be leading a discussion with my staff based on your podcast number 127, the first I've listened to, which I very much enjoyed. I have some thoughts that I didn't hear addressed and suspect will be raised by my staff, so I'm wondering if you can address them. Intuitive eating and the self-regulation that should result surely requires overcoming deprivation. I'm with you 200%. But someone whose diet is most exclusively fast food, for instance, or largely highly processed foods, isn't intuitively shifting choices when factors beyond deprivation play a role. Think of Brian Wansink's research and impact on how foods are presented, sensory triggers, etc. Why wouldn't you, as a dietitian and health advisor, direct individuals to shift food selection without a black and white approach, of course, or shame regarding these choices? Seems to me from the work I've done that discussion of hunger awareness as well as the role of other triggers to eating needs to be addressed to start the discussion of internal versus external cues to self-regulation. Looking forward to your thoughts." So thanks, Lori, for that great question. And before I answer, just my usual disclaimer that these answers and this podcast in general are for informational and educational purposes only and aren't a substitute for individual medical or mental health advice. So yeah, this is a great question, and I can see why you or your staff would wonder about that. And so first, I want to discuss what the science actually says on that front. And then I want to discuss why we're so quick to believe the worst about our food environment, and why I, as a dietitian working in a media and public health setting, am not about telling people how to shift how they eat, even in a non-black and white and non-shaming way, and why I'm not even really sure if such a way exists. So first, let's talk about the science. A 2017 review of the scientific research on how chronic dieting affects food consumption found that not only do dieters eat more in response to food-related advertisements or large portion sizes, but they also eat more of both high-fat foods and foods labeled as quote-unquote healthy or quote-unquote low-calorie, even if those labels are actually false. Dieters, in other words, are highly susceptible to both food industry marketing and diet industry marketing. And non-dieters, in contrast, aren't swayed by advertising or portion sizes. They tend to eat similar amounts no matter the context because they're driven by internal rather than external cues, which is what you're talking about. So that is from a study in 2017 by Pallavi and Herman called Restrained Eating and Food Cues, Recent Findings and Conclusions. And we'll link to that in the show notes for this episode so you can check that out. And of course, trigger warning for this and all scientific studies if you're someone who would potentially be triggered by numbers and BMI and all that stuff. So now you may have heard a different story about food cues because of Brian Wansink's research. And for anyone not familiar with him, Brian Wansink is largely responsible for the widespread belief that people eat more in response to larger portion sizes. He did a bunch of buzzy studies to that effect that have really gotten a lot of media attention over the past couple decades. And his studies have been cited more than 20,000 times in scientific journals and books. So he has or has had a lot of influence. But Wansink's research has subsequently been thoroughly discredited and debunked, with many of his studies being retracted by the journals they were published in, and many others having to issue a correction in those journals. And just a few months ago, because of all this discrediting that was going on of his research, he was forced to resign in disgrace from his post at Cornell University. So we actually need to be very skeptical of any of Wansink's findings and the findings of his acolytes. And in fact, much better quality evidence really shows that it's deprivation rather than portion sizes or other aspects of the food environment that makes people more likely to eat bigger quantities or eat in response to food marketing and availability. When people are driven by external cues, such as dieting and diet culture, they're more likely to respond to other external cues like food availability or advertising or marketing. And when people are driven by internal cues, when they're intuitive eaters and they're not dieters, they're not swayed by those things outside themselves. So they don't need to be told to make quote unquote better choices because they're capable of making choices on their own. And so I want to now get into like the why behind all of this, because I think one of the reasons that Wansink's research snookered so many people is because it seemed to reinforce what diet culture has already told us, what it's already made us believe and fear, which is that our food environment is making us eat quote unquote too much of the quote unquote wrong types of foods, right? Diet culture demonizes our food environment as the latest culprit in making us quote unquote overeat or gain weight, because of course, demonizing certain foods and ways of eating is a hallmark of diet culture, right? That's one of the aspects of my definition of diet culture. And this demonizing of certain foods and ways of eating is a convenient deflection from the real culprit, which is diet culture itself. So diet culture has a vested interest in making us look at all the other things that it's pretending are the culprit rather than its own belief system. And so when we jump to blaming the food environment and the food industry for Western culture's ills, as so many people do these days, we're actually just reinforcing the diet culture beliefs that drive people into disordered eating and eating disorders in the first place. And we're allowing the life thief that is diet culture to get away with its crimes, to steal people's lives and relationships with food, to push them into disordered eating and eating disorders, and to make them lose trust in themselves. You know, when we don't question diet culture's rhetoric, we just collude with it. So we as eating disorder professionals in particular need to be incredibly vigilant against these kinds of arguments and not buy into them, because when we do, we're just colluding with the diet mentality and the eating disorder. Now, all of that being said, I will grant that, yes, the 10th and last principle of intuitive eating is to use gentle nutrition awareness to help you care for your body. So, of course, there's a place for nutrition in intuitive eating. And yes, you know, if someone is only eating fast food or convenience food, they might not feel so great and they might benefit from bringing in some other kinds of foods into their life. And that could be part of gentle nutrition for them. But gentle nutrition is the last principle of intuitive eating, like I said, for a reason, because people really can't engage with nutrition in a way that's outside of the diet culture paradigm and free from the diet mentality until they do the work of breaking down that diet mentality and making peace with food and learning to honor their hunger and stop restricting, and all the other principles of intuitive eating, which is really the antidote to diet culture. And as we just discussed in the research on chronic dieting, the really important thing for putting people back in charge of their own food choices and helping them follow their own internal cues is helping them stop chronic dieting and break free from that mentality. So when I'm speaking to a large audience, like I am with this podcast or my writing, I never jump to the gentle nutrition principle, which again is the last principle of intuitive eating, because I know that the overwhelming majority of people that I'm talking to are in a place where they really need more help with the earlier principles, like especially breaking down the diet mentality and making peace with food and working through all those other principles that come before gentle nutrition. And the other thing is, if someone is eating nothing but fast food and convenience foods, it's also likely due to poverty and the inability to afford to spend the time or money that it requires to cook from scratch. Because remember, even if someone can afford to buy the ingredients to cook, they also need to have the time to prepare them. And both time and money are scarce for low-income people, many of whom have to work multiple jobs and don't have time to be chopping and sautéing and simmering when it's time to eat. So as someone with a master's in public health who worked in more traditional public health settings for years before doing the work that I do now, like teaching nutrition to clients in low-income communities, I really believe that the public health field needs to stop talking so much about nutrition and the, God forbid, so-called obesity epidemic, and start focusing more on ending deprivation in all its forms, whether that's the deprivation due to poverty or the deprivation due to diet culture or both. And in fact, a groundbreaking study from 2017 found that it often is both. So this study, which is called Food Insecurity and Eating Disorder Pathology, which we'll link to in the show notes as well, found that food insecurity is associated with significant levels of disordered eating and clinically diagnosable eating disorders, and that the people with the greatest degree of food insecurity also had the highest levels of internalized weight stigma, as well as the highest levels of compensatory bulimic and over-exercising behaviors, which is kind of mind-boggling. Remember that these are people with food insecurity. These are the highest levels of food insecurity, and they're doing these compensatory behaviors, and they're also self-stigmatizing because of their weight. So this means that even if binge eating begins in response to the deprivation of food insecurity rather than the deprivation of dieting, it's clear that the diet culture beliefs about body size also eventually come into play, even for people who are food insecure. So, in other words, food insecurity and diet culture are not just two separate silos, they're kind of interconnected. So yes, if I'm working with someone one-on-one and I know their history and I've worked with them through rejecting the diet mentality and overcoming deprivation and all the other principles of intuitive eating, then maybe I'll talk with them about food selection and how they might diversify their eating so that they're getting a range of foods beyond just fast and convenience foods. But that's usually a conversation for very far in our work together once they've really stepped outside of the diet culture paradigm and are no longer having trauma responses to any talk of nutrition or health, or getting triggered into orthorexic behaviors by any talk or nutrition of health, which can take a really long time and really depends on the person. So I hope that helps give you a little window into my thinking about this stuff and into maybe what we all need to be thinking about as eating disorder professionals and public health professionals listening to this podcast in terms of how we frame our discussion about nutrition and making sure that we're really helping people hang on to that internal wisdom about food that we're all born with. That's the default state. I'm always saying intuitive eating is the default mode, right? And so we need to work to help people get back to that innate internal wisdom and ability to be governed by internal cues before we start throwing a bunch of nutrition information at them. And the evidence really shows that when people are in touch with their internal cues, they're not really swayed by the outside stuff anyway. So I hope that helps. And if you want to submit your own question for a chance to have it answered on an upcoming episode, go to christyharrison.com/questions. That's christyharrison.com/questions. And then if you're ready to break free from diet culture once and for all and become an intuitive eater the way we were all born knowing how to do, because intuitive eating is the default mode, then come check out my intuitive eating online course. You'll get a wealth of guidance from me and support from your fellow participants. And as one participant named Kate put it recently, I cannot thank you enough for this resource and the online community you've created. It's a vital buffer against diet culture. Or as another participant named Emily said, you are just an effing legend. Since starting this course, I'm now making steps to starting a business, and that could not have happened without the freeing up of headspace that your content has created. Learn more and sign up for the course at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. We're brought to you today by Zero. For anyone who smokes cigarettes and wants to quit for good, Zero is a new company that's making it easier. They make quitting simple with a method clinically proven to curb cigarette cravings and nicotine withdrawal symptoms. I have a good friend who tried to quit smoking more than 10 times before he was finally successful because he tried to just white knuckle it most of those times, and he used a lot of self-shaming techniques. And of course, those don't work, right? And it wasn't until he finally got some help that he was able to do it in a more self-compassionate way and finally have the quitting stick. With Zero, you get physician-prescribed medication to curb your cigarette cravings, plus nicotine gum to help fight withdrawal symptoms, and continued support. It takes just 5 minutes to get signed up, and it's all done online. You answer a few simple questions about your smoking and medical history, and a licensed physician will review your information. You never have to visit a doctor's office or a pharmacy. That makes Zero both simple and effective. See if you qualify today and get more than 50% off your first month by going to quitwithzero.com/foodpsych. That's quitwithzero.com/foodpsych, FOODPSYCH, for more than 50% off your first month. quitwithzero.com/foodpsych. We're also brought to you by Tomboy X. I'm so psyched to have them as a sponsor of the show because size and gender inclusiveness are central to their whole brand, and I love to support brands who really get it like they do. Tomboy X is revolutionizing the underwear game by making underwear to fit you and how you see yourself. They have everything from bikinis, briefs, boxer briefs, trunks, and boy shorts to soft bras and racerback bras, which are by far the most comfortable bras I've ever worn, and I'm actually wearing one right now as we speak, as I have done on many of these ads that I've recorded for them, not intentionally, just because they're super comfortable and I like wearing them. They come in everyday basic colors and fun seasonal prints like red and green plaid, and the cutest little penguins wearing sweaters and flamingos doing holiday activities. I cannot even with these cute seasonal prints that they have right now. Regardless of where you fall on the size or gender spectrum, Tomboy X offers amazing underwear that anybody can feel comfortable in. Now you can support the podcast and support their amazing mission at the same time. Just go to tomboyx.com/foodpsych and check out their special bundles and pack pricing. Foodpsych listeners will also get an extra 15% off with the code FOODPSYCH. Again, just use the code FOODPSYCH, that's FOODPSYCH, for an extra 15% off. Ditch whatever you're wearing for a pair of Tomboy X underwear. Go to tomboyx.com/foodpsych. And finally, we're brought to you today by Audible. It's the time of year when everyone is thinking about thoughtful gifts. So why not give yourself or a loved one the gift of an Audible membership? Now is the best time to do it with a special offer. Audible lets you access an unbeatable selection of audiobooks, including bestsellers, motivation, thrillers, memoirs, and more. And they have all the major books from past podcast guests, including Kelsey Miller's Big Girl, Jess Baker's Land Whale, Sonia Renee Taylor's The Body Is Not an Apology, Linda Bacon and Lucy Aframore's Body Respect, Megan Crabb's Body Positive Power, and so many more. And right now, for a limited time, you can get 3 months of Audible for just $6.95 a month. That's more than half off the regular price. Give yourself the gift of listening, and while you're at it, think about giving the gift of Audible to someone on your list. For more, go to audible.com/foodpsych or text foodpsych, FOODPSYCH, to 500500. That's AUDIBLE.com/foodpsych or text foodpsych to 500500. And now, without any further ado, let's go talk to Marci Evans. So, Marci, welcome back to the show. So glad to be talking with you again.
Hey, Christy. Thanks so much for having me back. It is my absolute pleasure to be here with you.
Yes, such a pleasure to talk with you always. And we last spoke for the podcast in episode 80, which I think if anyone hasn't heard, they should definitely go check out. It's about why there's no such thing as food addiction or what the science actually says about food addiction. And it's a very nuanced, interesting conversation. So we had a great talk there. And I want to have another one of those today and get into digestive health and the nuances of that. But before we do, just catch us up a little bit on what you've been up to in your life since I think it was a couple years ago that we recorded that. So what have the last 2 years brought for you?
Gosh, it was a couple of years ago, which seems a little bit hard to believe. And that was such a fun conversation. I feel like you have invited me on to talk about two of my favorite topics that I get really excited about. So, a couple of years ago, like you said, it was food addiction. And I've actually spent the past couple of years talking a fair bit about it more. It's definitely one of those topics that is really, really resonant for folks. I think it also is kind of a big in the headlines, kind of like attention grabby kind of a topic. And I feel like what we're going to be talking about today is also a little bit similar to that. But in terms of what I've been up to, my gosh, I've been working a lot, but trying not to have my whole life be wrapped up in work, but doing some really fun stuff. I've been really excited about a project that I've been working on with a colleague that we both know and love, Lisa Pearl. We've been doing work, and I know that she was a guest as well on your podcast. And so we are having a really good time developing the dietetic internship at Simmons College that specializes in eating disorders and teaching graduate level courses and introducing students and interns to these concepts of health at every size and intuitive eating. So that has really been lighting my fire. And then I have also been doing a lot of body image work with our good pal, Fiona Sutherland. So we have been doing some live workshops. And then what's really exciting is that we are on the cusp of launching an online course for body image work for clinicians. So I was actually working on one of our slide decks right before we hopped on our call, and also have a really exciting online course that I'm in the process of building with my colleague Lauren Deere related to what we're going to be talking about today, this sort of intersection between eating disorders and digestive disorders. So I've really had the awesome opportunity to take some of these topics I'm really passionate about and do some deeper dives with them. And that's where I've been spending a lot of my time, in addition to my clinical work, which still keeps me very busy, and that I still get a lot of joy from.
I so admire your ability to do those deep dives, and also your ability to have multiple projects going at once, because I'm the same way. I like to have like lots of different things, simmering, and I feel like you juggle them all really well.
Oh, maybe it appears that way. I don't always feel that way. Sometimes my brain feels like it's a little bit of a mess, but it is really fun because really we are so specialized, kind of where we spend our time and what we think about, that to sort of have these subspecialties and places where we can get really interested in these different kinds of conversations and the research, I feel like keeps me really alive in the work, and is, always really interesting.
Yeah, it is. And I think it's also really helpful for people who are reading the headlines and just out there in diet culture, getting whatever messages are thrown their way. 'Cause, diet culture, as one of my pet projects, my book, I'm always saying like diet culture is such a shapeshifter, and I'm really tracing that shape-shifting quality in the book, but it's hard to know what form it's going to take next. And so whether it's like arguments about food addiction, whether it's stuff about digestive disorders getting twisted in the service of diet culture, like all of that stuff, I think people need resources to help address that and help push back against it so that they can stay strong in their recovery. So I think it's awesome that you're attuned to what those things are and giving people resources to support that.
Oh, thank you. And I cannot wait. I'm waiting eagerly for your book. No pressure.
Yeah, no pressure. Well, it's like, as we're recording this, it's 2.5 weeks before the deadline. So definitely feeling some pressure, but I'm actually feeling really good too, because I took some time off the podcast in the summer and got a lot done then, like a big old rough draft. And now I'm just kind of going back and nuancing and fleshing things out and taking away, just an edit of my own stuff before I turn it into my editor. And then hopefully it'll be in good shape for her. So,
oh, that's really exciting. Congratulations.
Thank you. And I'm psyched when I read it too. I'm like, I think this is something good that I've done with my time,
Oh, that's got to feel so rewarding. I know sometimes I've done projects where you spend so much time on it and you get to the end and you're like, does this even make sense anymore? Mm-hmm. So it's a really good sign you're sort of in this final stretch and it's still leaving you feeling really, really excited. That's really, it's just awesome. I'm really happy.
Thank you. Yes, I'm happy too. I feel like it's what I'm meant to be doing. But yeah, let's dive into talking a little bit about the digestive disorder stuff, because you and Lauren Deere have this amazing presentation that I've seen you do at eating disorder conferences about the intersection of eating disorders and digestive disorders that I think like blows people's minds. And I know, I was like pretty much had my mind blown the first time I saw it too, because it talks about a lot of stuff that I think we all, especially anyone who's attuned to like diet culture and orthorexia and sort of the ways that those show up for people with eating disorders, it's like you can sort of understand how those things are weaving into people's relationship with their digestive health, but you laid it out so clearly and really highlighted a lot of the research that I hadn't really seen before. So I think it's just super interesting to start maybe with that. What does the research say about the intersection of eating disorders and digestive disorders?
Sure. Yeah. I had such a good time developing the presentation that Lauren and I have given a number of times together. And the background is, I am primarily a specialist as an eating disorders dietitian, and Lauren was primarily a specialist as a digestive health dietitian. And I had actually reached out to her for some cross supervision. And I was just really noting the number of my clients with eating disorders who had these digestive issues. And I thought, oh my gosh, I feel like it's almost every client in my caseload. And there were some questions that I was feeling really stuck on. And I thought to myself, I really need to speak with someone who's a specialist in digestive disorders. And in conversation with Lauren, she said something that blew my mind and actually cracked this whole collaboration open. I was saying to her about my dilemma around the FODMAP diet, which probably so many of your listeners have heard of the FODMAP diet, but it's a diet that has been very, very well researched and is utilized to treat irritable bowel syndrome. The downside being is that it requires a pretty extensive elimination protocol that can be really hard to follow and is really not ideal for somebody who has an eating disorder or has an eating disorders history, because it is so difficult and just very, very restrictive. And so I was talking with her about this dilemma with the FODMAP diet and the population that I see. And she said, well, Marci, there's some really compelling research that shows that gut-directed hypnotherapy is just as effective as an elimination diet. And I was like, what? So stop, rewind. What did you just say? And it just completely opened my mind to the possibility of what tools and resources do we have to offer that is perhaps less disruptive to a person's relationship to food. And that's when she and I really began collaborating. And I said, Lauren, this has got to be a presentation. I can do the heavy lifting on doing some of the research of looking at this intersection between the two. And you can really bring so much knowledge and so much experience related to interventions that are effective and potentially less harmful. And so that's really kind of the genesis of our working relationship together. And I have learned so much from Lauren over the years. I continue to learn from her. And it's kind of funny. It's almost like I've developed a subspecialty in digestive disorders and she's developed a subspecialty in eating disorders. So it's a nice kind of match made in heaven. So that's a little bit of the background. But, as I was diving, into the literature and saying, well, okay, I can say anecdotally, my practice, when I'm working with someone with an eating disorder or a history of an eating disorder, we're also working with some type of digestive system or symptom, whether it's, bloating or whether it's constipation. And so I started to look at this intersection between what are called functional gut disorders. And I'm wondering if it'd be helpful to sort of explain what that is.
Sure, yeah.
So functional gut disorders are essentially disorders of the GI system that don't necessarily have a certain marker that you can test. So for example, celiac disease falls under the category of a non-functional gut disorder because we know we can look at different parameters for celiac disease, whether we're doing a biopsy of the intestine or whether we're looking at a blood marker. Other things that you can test for that actually have an objective marker are like Crohn's disease. But we have a host of other diseases where there's really no objective marker to measure. It's really reflective of a series of symptoms. And it has a lot more to do with communication pathways between the brain and the gut, and sometimes how that communication can become disrupted and results in a series of symptoms. So this can include things like heartburn, or I was mentioning bloating, constipation, diarrhea, the big umbrella term that we often hear folks describe, irritable bowel syndrome, as a functional gut disorder, pelvic pain or problems with the pelvic floor, all fall under that category. And so some of the research that's looking at this kind of overlap, I almost just imagine it like a Venn diagram between digestive disorders and eating disorders. The most common occurrence of digestive disorders in that overlap are these functional gut disorders. So I started, delving into the literature, look at, well, how prevalent is this? And it became really clear that what I was seeing anecdotally in my practice was also reflected in the literature. So if you first look at, well, what about the number of people with a functional gut disorder? What percentage of them also have a co-occurring eating disorder? And according to the research, it's around 16-ish%, give or take. But if you flip it, you see that the number of people with an eating disorder, the research shows that the number of people with a co-occurring functional gut disorder is well over 90%, even some of the studies demonstrating as high as 98%.
It's incredible.
And I was like, holy moly, we have all of these folks with an eating disorder who are suffering with these digestive issues and having it also, I mean, this is again sort of speaking from what it's like for me in the room as a clinician. A lot of times providers not taking their symptoms very seriously. It's sort of written off as it's all in your mind. It's just these quote unquote, I'm really careful about using this word, but often this is sort of the language that's used. You're sort of crazy, making it up in your mind. Those of you, with an eating disorder, people with mental illness, and really having seen my clients not be taken seriously for their symptoms, which is just really, really unfortunate. So part of my work has also been doing a lot of understanding how to advocate on behalf of my clients with their physicians. But the next layer of the research that I wanted to mention very quickly, but it's a really important point, is this secondary statistic is that when we're looking at these co-occurring conditions, is that we see that there's a shared co-occurring condition that is also very high, and that is a co-occurring addition of another psychiatric diagnosis. So often it's anxiety or depression. So we see very high rates of anxiety and depression in folks with functional gut disorders, as well as, of course, folks with eating disorders. And so really the researchers are saying, gosh, we kind of have a core feature here between folks with functional gut disorders and eating disorders. And central to this is mental health. And this is the piece where I am very passionate. I know you are equally passionate to this. And we're going to, of course, unpack a lot of this together today, is that it is natural when your digestion is feeling off or you're in pain or you don't feel well to want to think about, well, how do I change my diet? I think that's a really reasonable sort of next place to go because, we think about digestion and what goes in the mouth is going to affect how our digestion is feeling. But central to all of this is actually related to the communication pathways that are connected between our brain, the brain in our head, and the brain in our gut. And that is really closely connected to our temperament, our stress management, as well as our vulnerability towards anxiety and depression.
So that's so interesting because I think the dismissive point of view, like you say, that some clinicians unfortunately adopt is like, oh, it's all in your head. You're just, it's psychosomatic. And it's actually so much more complicated than that, but there is a connection between the brain and the gut, right? So it's not just that you're making something up and therefore feeling it, but actually that you're potentially, and let's, talk about what the pathways are here, what the sort of cause and effect situation might look like if we know at all. But it seems like maybe there's something going on with either anxiety and depression triggering symptoms in the gut. And also with disordered eating, I know from some of the research I've read that you've linked me to as well, that it seems to be that the eating disorder precedes the digestive disorder in most cases.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you've named a number of really important things. You can guide me in terms of maybe how we want to cover those topics, because everything that you just named, I think, is really worth breaking down a little bit more. But that piece about that dismissive attitude, I think is really unfortunate, obviously, but for a number of reasons. One of those reasons being this idea that if something is named as psychosomatic, that it's not real or it's in your brain, when in reality, we know that the connection between our physical body and our emotional body, as well as what's happening in our minds, is on a physiological level completely real. Like it has an actual impact in the physiology, in the experience that you have living inside of your own body. It's not that it's made up, it's that the impact of our emotions literally shape and change how we're feeling physically. And so I would love to help folks feel, I think, less pathologized and less self-blaming and less sort of shamed around the mental health piece, because this real life connection between what's happening spiritually, emotionally, and physically is so, so, so important. And I think that if you're seeing a provider who's speaking in that sort of shaming sort of way, is really communicating to you their ignorance and their lack of understanding, which is just unfortunate and a potential opportunity to maybe advocate to see another provider. I know that can be really complicated and really difficult, but it's in those moments to sort of draw on your own strength and say, this isn't about my making something up in my mind. This interaction is really reflecting to me the limited understanding that my provider has.
So important. And I think, I'm remembering in my own days of irritable bowel syndrome and trying to get a diagnosis for what was going on for me, like having missed periods and lots of other stuff that I ended up blaming on gluten, but that in fact was due to my disordered eating at the time.
Mm-hmm.
It was suggested to me a number of times, like, well, stress can really cause a lot of this. And this was like well-meaning providers that weren't totally trying to dismiss, but I think I picked up this little bit of, and maybe also from the culture, picked up this dismissiveness of psychosomatic, anything that's like, well, if it's caused by stress, that means it's all in my head. That means that they're saying that I'm nutso, and like that was the message that got internalized, because I think that message is sort of floating around in the culture too. So that I've noticed that when I try to talk to people about the connection between the brain and the gut, and like the fact that maybe, some of someone's anxiety or disordered thinking about food or disordered behaviors about food could be the cause of what's going on, or that we need to look at that in the relationship of their gut and their eating. It's like they don't want to go there, and
Mm-hmm.
there's a certain amount of that might be the protecting the eating disorder, and there's also a certain amount that I think might be reflective of like this stigma that we have in our society against anything that's perceived as a psychosomatic illness.
Yeah, I think that's really, really well articulated. I think that's can be very true.
So it's tricky.
It is tricky. One of the things that I also heard you say, and you can let me know if you kind of want to move in this direction, was kind of the question that I was also asking myself, which is a little bit of like the chicken or the egg, right? Is this, are the eating disorders leading to all these digestive issues? Are the digestive issues kind of leading to an eating disorder? So we can take a look at that, kind of what the literature has to say.
Totally. That would be amazing, because I think that's a question on a lot of people's minds, I'm sure.
Yeah. And I would imagine that a lot of people's intuitive radar is probably fairly accurate, which is, yes, it's both. One of the things that kind of broke my heart when I was digging through the research is that I found a study that looked at essentially summarizing what are the biggest risk factors for the development of an eating disorder. And one of the things that was listed, I had actually never seen listed before, as somebody who for over a decade has attended, I don't even know the number of eating disorders conferences and the number of research papers that I've read. I'd never heard this before. And what was listed was early childhood gastrointestinal problems, listed as one of the top risk factors for the later development of an eating disorder. And I thought, oh my gosh, what's the work that we're doing with our pediatric doctors and our pediatric gastroenterologists, that it really does make sense that if from an early stage, right, that there are, whether it's pain or discomfort or special diets that have to be followed, not to mention what we were talking about in terms of the co-occurring mental health piece, where often there is a certain type of temperament that is often common in folks who are both vulnerable to some of these GI issues as well as the development of an eating disorder. And I can raise my hand to a lot of these sort of similar, these temperamental, traits, folks who really want to follow the rules and who really want to do things precisely and can be kind of perfectionistic. Those, again, my hand is still raised. Those of us who tend to be worriers, those of us who feel things really strongly. I am someone I really identify as somebody who really feels a lot and can feel things really strongly. And those are the same types of temperamental risk factors that can put a child at risk for certain GI issues. And we know that they're the same type of risk factors that can put us at risk for the development of an eating disorder. So it does make sense that there is this sort of background risk factor for certain children to then later develop problems with an eating disorder. We think about certain GI issues, this someone who is really wanting to reduce any type of negative sensation that they're having, which again is so understandable. So maybe they are really, really perfect at following the diet, or they go on the diet and it gives them some relief. And it's a little bit of, well, if that was helpful, maybe a little bit more will be even more helpful. And not to mention the risk of malnutrition and accidentally sort of stumbling into the rabbit hole of a restrictive type eating disorder is very possible, right? When somebody is not getting adequately nourished originally, for something connected to a medical diagnosis. So we do see it from that direction. But also the research that initially, I will say it, when I give this presentation, I warn the audience, I'll say, this is going to be the low point of the presentation. It's going to feel like a bummer, but I promise you there is like a rainbow at the end of this story, but this is really important. And this is what like the drumbeat of my presentation when I'm speaking to clinicians, because sometimes what can happen in the eating disorders field is that we can overly simplify things for our clients. And we say, oh, as soon as you get renourished, this is all going to go away. Now, caveat, engaging in disordered eating patterns, whether it's, underfeeding yourself or overfeeding yourself or abusing certain things like laxatives or supplements or, caffeine, all sorts of eating disorder behaviors, we know from top of the GI tract to the bottom of the GI tract, the natural course is that it's going to disrupt digestion. Like without a doubt, disordered behaviors guaranteed are disrupting your digestion are going to have an impact. That's why we see in the literature those co-occurring rates as high as 98%. Just the very nature of being in the midst of an eating disorder disrupts digestion and will cause problems. However, sometimes we can overly simplify it and we can say essentially, I think unintentionally almost say it's a guarantee, you're going to recover from your eating disorder and it's all going to go away. And that's not always true, but like I said, it's not dire. So I'm just going to back up a little bit and explain what I mean. So baseline, we know, as I was just saying, is that eating disorder symptoms actually alter two things in the GI system. It alters gastrointestinal sensitivity as well as functionality. And then if you combine that with what I was mentioning earlier, so if we have these behaviors, in addition to a personality or these traits that are more sensing, sensitive, perfectionistic, is that we're essentially combining together the eating disorder along with the psychiatric condition, whether it's anxiety or depression. Those are the two that are most studied in the literature. That what seems to happen is that these two things coming together links into these what are called self-perpetuating cycles, where we get these behavioral patterns, right, that become really, really persistent and difficult to change. And what that seems to show, and it's been actually really, really important that now we're having research that really demonstrates that, what we see clinically, is that lays the foundation. It sort of opens the door to welcome in a functional gut disorder. So you have kind of these risk factors for your mood and your mental health. You throw in these eating disorder symptoms and your body's like, hey, I am just ripe for the development of some type of digestive issue. And then what we're seeing, and this was sort of the linchpin that like really got me really wanting to speak kind of loudly about this, is that we do know that what can happen is that a person can go through their eating disorder recovery. They can get to a really strong place in their recovery. They're no longer using those behaviors as a way to cope, right? They sort of getting to a more stable place with their mental and emotional well-being, their physical well-being. They're just, doing much better. But unfortunately, what's showing is that functional gut disorder, once it almost gets the ball rolling, it can persist independent of the eating disorder that caused those motor and sensitivity disturbances in the first place. So for some people, recovery from an eating disorder, getting nourished, working through that whole process is really enough, and they can move on and there are, no other problems. But for some people, those difficulties with digestion actually remain independent of their eating disorders recovery. And you were talking about diet culture being a shapeshifter, and it's actually similar with functional gut disorders, can also be a shapeshifter. That some of the research showed that the number of functional gut disorders as someone moves into recovery stays the same, but the type can change. So if a person says, oh man, I'm having a lot of trouble, say, in my stomach, I feel like it takes a long time for my food to get digested. Well, they could get farther along in their recovery and they're no longer having a problem with their stomach. They're having a problem further down in their intestines, for instance. So it can look different. And one of the things that we can talk about it now, or we can talk about later, is some of the newer research coming out related to the gut microbiome, and how that's maybe, and again, this is all sort of working stages of early research, is sort of indicating that might demonstrate some of the reasons why sometimes symptoms can continue to go past or sort of go beyond a person's place in their recovery.
Absolutely. I'd love to get into that. I think that's so fascinating. I'm also curious, though, to talk a little bit about the distinction between eating disorders and disordered eating, because I know that a lot of people, especially in diet culture, with all the weight stigma that is prevalent even in the eating disorder treatment world, don't get a diagnosis, right? Don't meet the criteria for a full-on diagnosis, but might still have these disordered behaviors that could be precipitating functional gut disorders. And I saw there's like a 2015 roundup or review of literature on the connection, I think, between disordered eating behaviors and functional gut disorders, as well as some just general GI disorders that don't fall under that functional umbrella. And I think the review said that like up to 44% of people who have IBS or celiac disease or inflammatory bowel disease, which are two that are not functional gut disorders, but mechanical gut disorders.
Mm-hmm.
People in all of those camps and with all of those diagnoses, up to 44% have some disordered eating behaviors. And that was sort of a bi-directional thing as well. Whereas, for some people, it might have started with a diagnosis and then they fell down a rabbit hole with disordered eating because of the restrictions that they had to do for their diagnosis. And some people, the disordered eating occurred first and led to the irritable bowel syndrome symptoms or whatever. So it was sort of both ways. But I thought it was interesting that made a distinction, or that didn't talk about just people with diagnosed eating disorders, but with disordered eating symptoms, that it didn't matter whether or not they were diagnosed. So I'm curious to sort of hear your experience and your thoughts on that in terms of what you've seen in the research and what you've seen clinically about disordered eating behaviors, even without a diagnosis, and the connection with functional and general gut disorders.
I am so glad you mentioned that, Christy, and I have not seen that research, so I'm going to ask that you promise to send it to me.
I will. I'll link to it in the show notes for this too, for anyone who's listening and wants to learn about it.
Perfect, because the distinction you're making is such an important one, and I feel like it's one that often I don't sort of speak to specifically enough because I almost take it for granted in my own mind. And so I'm really, really glad that you put a pause point here so we can kind of tease this apart more. So I tend to be a type of clinician where I don't worry about the specifics of diagnoses very much. And not to say that they don't matter at all. I think in certain ways it can be important in terms of guiding some of the things that we might do to try to be helpful to our clients. And they perhaps have a place in terms of standardizing research and insurance and all that. But from a day-to-day sort of sitting with my clients type of purpose, I don't really think in the language of diagnoses. And I don't really think about when I'm sitting with someone, do they exactly meet the criteria for an actual eating disorder diagnosis, I really don't know that it matters very much. It's sort of like, I want to hear more about your lived experience. And if this is troubling you and you feel upset in your mind, you feel upset inside of your body, that's really what I care about. And I guess from my vantage point that, perhaps the research has to look at it in a little bit more of a specific way. But I would say anecdotally, in terms of my clinical practice, it matters very little. So if I have someone who has, really fits the most specific criteria for bulimia and we're working with their digestive issues, I don't necessarily think so different for somebody who maybe doesn't exactly meet that criteria. I'm thinking about, what's their day-to-day like? How are they nourishing themselves? What problematic maybe tools are they falling back on? How are they leaning back into those patterns that are really problematic, whether it's eating diet food or using a lot of unhelpful, I'm thinking about like calorie-free things, or those foods that have a lot of things put into them so that they are lower calorie or trying to suppress the appetite, that I don't necessarily worry about the exact diagnosis, because it's the day-to-day behaviors and how a person is treating their body that is really going to have an impact on how they're feeling, as well as their gastrointestinal health. So I think the point that you're making is such an important one, that wherever a person is along the spectrum, that continuing to engage in a lot of those patterns and behaviors are going to have an impact, regardless if you fit that sort of exact diagnosis or not.
Yes, thank you. That's really helpful to clarify, because I think, in the research, it's like framed as eating, diagnosed eating disorders a lot of the time. And so I think people might feel like, well, I don't fit into that camp, and so maybe my digestive stuff is not about that or whatever. So I think it's good to just clarify that like any disordered behavior can have that effect. And like you said, by nature, disordered behaviors cause an upset and an impact in the gastrointestinal system.
Mm-hmm.
I also really love that you brought up like calorie-free stuff and diet stuff, because that stuff is so tied to gastrointestinal problems, and a lot of people don't recognize that either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's actually one of the first places, when I'm doing an assessment, particularly with someone where we're really actively working on trouble with their digestion, as well as maybe their disordered eating, is that I'm really screening for things that have like a lot of those fake sweeteners and sort of fake products added in addition to like high amounts of caffeine, or foods that are considered healthy, but they're eating in really, really high volume. That's kind of the baseline place that I begin, is that a lot of the attempting to shut appetite down, whether it's going too long without eating, or eating in a really imbalanced way, or eating a lot of those products to try to fill yourself up, or chewing a lot of gum, it's those same behaviors that people use to try to shut their appetite down or not fully fuel themselves that create havoc on the digestive function. So it's like we're rooting out dieting behaviors even more so than I think about, certainly eating disorder behaviors, but it's like under the umbrella of like dieting behaviors.
Totally. And there's such a fine line. I mean, I think other than certain behaviors like bulimia symptoms and stuff are clearly eating disorder behaviors, not really recommended by any diets in this day and age. But otherwise, I think for the most part, it is all sort of under the umbrella of like dieting behavior, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
And I love what you said too about the things that people perceive as healthy, like I see so many people who come in eating just excessive amounts of fruits and vegetables, or huge amounts of like things with a ton of added fiber that are quote unquote healthy versions of things or whatever, or framed as like minimally processed or whole food based, whatever, energy bars or meal replacements or blah, blah, blah. And they're like eating a ton of these things, and they're eating so much fiber that they're having bloating and diarrhea and constipation and, lots of different things that can potentially happen from eating excessive amounts of fiber, but not recognizing that, because it's like, well, I'm eating healthy, I'm eating clean, I'm not eating anything processed, right? And so actually,
Right.
I feel like in those cases, I've found a lot of people have a lot of relief from cutting back on the things they consider so clean and actually adding in more of what they might consider refined, or,
Mm-hmm.
the foods that get so demonized under the wellness diet in this day and age.
Yes. 100% agree.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit now about the piece with the gut microbiome, because I think that's also something that people like, that's such a buzzword now. And I think diet culture has gotten a hold of the gut microbiome, this idea of the gut microbiome. And so how do we like talk about it and understand this emerging research, which is still, as you said, very emerging, without falling into that trap of like, oh, I have to hack my gut microbiome or whatever?
Yeah, it's a really good sort of preface that you laid there, Christy, is that I think that we have to talk about it very carefully. It reminds me of how I talk about when I'm talking about food addiction, is that this is early stage research, and the temptation that we have, especially if we're in pain or we have a problem that we're trying to solve, is that we can make really big leaps forward where we don't really have enough information to make that leap. So that's just kind of my little disclaimer here, that I'm happy to talk about the state of the research as best as I understand it, and then kind of draw kind of that line around, what does this mean and what are the implications and what can we do about it? We don't have a lot of answers. We have many more questions than we do answers. But what the research is really helping us to understand more is that there is more and more evidence that there is this, of course we know, and we were talking about this earlier, this communication pathway between our gut brain and our head brain. And not only does our nervous system communicate between the head and the gut, but in addition to that, there is our microbiome, right, that lives in our intestine, right? The microbiota that lives in our intestine also communicates between the gut and the brain. So it's not just our nervous system, it's actually the microbiome there in our gut that's communicating.
And for anyone who doesn't know what the microbiome is, can you just give a little overview of like what that means?
Sure. Yeah. I think it's really, really easy for it to feel a little bit confusing and a little bit like there's just, what does that mean when we're using this word microbiome and we sort of throw it around? So it's great to sort of kind of slow down and say, what are we talking about here? But it's essentially, they're microorganisms that live in our gut. They literally live inside of our gut and they're hanging out there, but they do so much work. And that's one of the things that's really, really interesting that we're learning more and more about, is that they are incredibly active, that they are providing a lot of functions in terms of how they're operating inside of our body. So they seem to have impact on a number of things. But again, these microorganisms are, again, their function, we're learning about it, but we don't have it fully fleshed out, but they seem to have an impact in these communication pathways on our mood, as well as the development of certain medical conditions, as well as things like cognition. So they seem to be really, really active. So we're connecting it to things like depression and anxiety and pain, even multiple sclerosis, cardiovascular risk. So they seem to be playing this role inside of our bodies, even though they are sort of their independent hosts living inside of us. So when we say microbiota, we're really talking about bacteria that's living inside of our intestines. And ideally, they're located predominantly inside of our large intestine, and we tend to run into more trouble when they migrate into our small intestines. So most of the bacteria that lives in our body, because we have bacteria that's not just located in our GI tract, but most of it does live within our GI tract. So research that I've found shows that the 95% of the bacteria that is in our body is located in the GI tract, which is why there's so much research looking at the gut microbiome specifically. But some of the numbers that get thrown around that I think are really interesting, this idea that we have far more microbes or these microorganisms living in our body than we actually have human cells. I've even seen that we have like a 10-to-1 ratio, 10 microbes that are non-human living inside of our human body compared to human cells, which is just kind of mind-blowing.
That is really mind-blowing. And it is, yeah, like you said, very emerging research, and we don't know exactly what their functions are because we sort of just discovered their existence not that long ago in the grand scheme of things, right?
Yeah, in the grand scheme of things, I would have to do a little bit more digging. So I don't want to just misspeak sort of off the cuff, but I do think that so much of this research has really been blossoming within the past 10 years, which, in the field of science is not all that long, but they are connecting it to symptoms as well as disease states, because it does seem that these microorganisms are essentially communicating with our human cells. And so that's kind of the most simple way to say it. So for example, researchers who are just beginning really over the past couple of years, beginning to look at, okay, so we know that these microbes, right, these little microorganisms that are living in our gut are communicating with this gut-brain axis and influencing these communication pathways. Well, what about folks with eating disorders? Now, unfortunately, the research has only been done in folks with a diagnosis with anorexia nervosa. So we sort of have a very, very small subset of the eating disorders population. But what it shows is that microbiome plays a role in things related to weight gain, weight loss, as well as, this is sort of scientific, babble, energy extraction from the diet. And I loved reading this because, of course, I was like, oh my gosh, this to me makes such a case for health at every size. And this idea that we can't just sort of engineer our bodies to be exactly what we want them to be, is what this research shows is that depending on your gut microbiome, let's see, I could eat a certain amount of food and you could eat that exact same amount of food. And the amount of energy my body takes from it is going to be different than the amount of energy your body takes from it. So this idea of calorie counting totally falls apart because we have these gut microbiome inside of us actually deciding for us how much of that energy am I actually going to extract, which to me is like really, really interesting.
Yeah. Although I totally worry that diet culture is going to seize on that and be like, okay, so let's like figure out how to make the microbiome of a larger bodied person much more like the microbiome of a smaller bodied person. Let's like hack the microbiome to change people's weight.
Oh, totally.
I can't even.
I think that's probably not that far around the corner. Like, I think that fear is probably going to be realized pretty soon because researchers are already doing kind of versions of that research with stool cultures. But this is, again, where you and I kind of really put up that caution sign and say, we are so early in our understanding of this, that the idea that if you see a supplement coming up on the shelves really soon that is sort of selling to you, take this blend of probiotics, essentially, like take this bacteria to get your body to a certain size that is, we will call absolute bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
That science does not exist.
Full on bullshit.
That is fat phobia. That is what that is.
And I'm sure that there's going to, diet culture, anyone who's steeped in diet culture has such a desire to find that magic bullet, to find the thing that's going to like finally shrink bodies, because decades and decades of research has shown that bodies really resist being shrunk and they'll do everything they can to not be shrunk. And so I think that this is just another one of those things that the culture at large is going to put out as though it's this magic bullet. But just as, there's been so many things like that over the years, like leptin was supposed to be this magic bullet before, and diet pills, various kinds of diet pills that have come on the market that have then had to be recalled because they caused heart problems and things like that. So
I was totally thinking about the leptin example when you said that. That's what it reminded me. This idea that a scientist is going to discover a key and that we can just, sort of supplement it into our bodies, to get this desired result of a smaller body has like failed us and failed us and failed us. So perhaps I shouldn't be, I so easily am like just sort of discounted. I'm like, that's ridiculous. But in reality, this is what we're all up against, because I do not doubt that we are going to have like the gut microbiome diet or the gut microbiome supplement.
Oh, yeah.
Around the corner.
And even now, like some of the wellness diet stuff that's out there, I think is talking about the gut microbiome in very vague terms, because there's not really enough that we even know about it, but it's like, feed your microbiome anti-inflammatory foods to blah, 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 whatever. And like, again, that science is so emerging and so poorly understood that it's just a matter of diet culture seizing on this little emerging research that we have to say, here's a way, here's this magic bullet, here's the thing that you haven't thought of, and this is what's going to shrink your body. And in the case of the wellness diet, it's like, it's not about weight loss, but it's about wellness, but it'll also shrink your body. PS, side effects.
And PS, yeah, exactly. Well, one of the things that I think is really interesting that the research is showing us, even though we keep saying the research is fairly limited, because it is, particularly when it comes to eating disorders. I want to be very clear, this research I'm about to share is limited in terms of the number of studies that have been conducted. And also a lot of the studies have a very small sample size. So that means the conclusions that we can draw from it and its applicability is going to be really, really limited. But what the research does seem to show is that, and we can say this one part very confidently, that having a diversity within our gut microbiome is correlated with positive things, right? That we see greater health correlated with diversity. And so my little quip is like, diversity is always a good thing. We always want diversity, whether we're talking about our gut microbiome or we're talking about the friends that we make or, the perspectives that we listen to, we want diversity. And that what we do see is that in the case of starvation and undernutrition, that not only are we starving our own bodies, but we are starving our gut microbiome. And that it, makes some good sense that these microbiome are living off of our bodies essentially, and that they also die off and don't thrive. That there are some consequences that we're, beginning to try to understand of, well, what does this mean? And again, we don't want to put this in a causal relationship, but we can say that it's related. But one of the things that researchers noticed when they were studying folks with eating disorders is that as the people were in recovery and getting renourished, that as they tested their gut microbiome, it moved to a healthier state, meaning it became more diverse, it became more vibrant, it became richer, that we know that a well-nourished body is going to have a vibrant and stronger gut microbiome. But one of the things that the researchers were really surprised about is that, and again, this was sort of short-term research, that upon refeeding, which we know is not the same as recovering from an eating disorder, but that sort of early stage of getting renourished, is that the gut microbiome did improve, but it didn't fully recover. And there were similarities between the profiles of the microbiome of folks who were recovering from anorexia as compared to folks with GI problems and diagnosed GI disorders. And so we were looking at, oh my gosh, we have these folks who are renourished, who had anorexia, as compared to folks with a diagnosable GI disorder, and their gut microbiome looks the same. So when we have these sort of symptoms that persist for people, maybe how much of that is the consequence of the gut microbiome being damaged by the lack of nourishment. And so it certainly makes a case for the importance of, certainly nourishing in our bodies, and that threat of deprivation, whether it's starvation from a diet or starvation from what we would say is a clinical eating disorder, which you and I don't really see the difference, maybe in terms of severity, but essentially the exact same behavior really has an impact beyond maybe what we had considered before.
Oh, that's so fascinating. And yeah, like you said, it's this early emerging research, but it does seem to suggest that there's something going on with the starvation of the microbiome that is potentially having an impact on people's digestion, and that communication between the brain and the gut, or the gut brain and the head brain, as you say.
Yeah, exactly right.
And so with that information, what would you like people to take away from that now, given that this is such emerging research and given the sort of pitfalls potentially of people getting too obsessed with changing their gut microbiome and doing anything in that regard?
Yeah, I think it's a thoughtful question to ask, what's the take home message? What do I do with that? I think as far as we can take it, as far as really our understanding of what's happening in the body, is really this appreciation for their, significant impacts to becoming malnourished, to undernourishing our bodies, and especially when our diet becomes very, very limited. So folks feel comfortable and they sort of feel like, well, I eat these 5 foods and they're so packed with nutrition. Actually being really limited in your diet is going to have a negative impact. So I think it makes the case for, enjoying a wide variety of foods and moving away from that restrictive mentality. But in terms of real specifics of eat this or have this, or, drawing those conclusions that become very prescriptive. I would say we really don't have enough understanding of what's happening in the body, nor have those things been tested. So you were kind of saying, Christy, earlier, that you see these wellness diets put out, and those are based on people's ideas. Those are not things that have actually been tested. We don't know that your microbiome changes if you follow this protocol over a long period of time. Sure, have there been research conducted on certain nutritional aspects of, folks who eat different types of fruits and things like that? Yes, actually, there is that research that does exist, but it's very, very preliminary and it's very short-term research. We can't speak with this kind of confidence that you're guaranteed going to have all of these outcomes if you follow this diet. That kind of sort of prescriptive diet, follow this X, Y, and Z, it gets right into that wellness diet that you were mentioning, and really overreaches what the science has to tell us right now. I think that we can be curious about it. We can wonder about the research, but this idea of taking it beyond that becomes pretty problematic.
That's such a great take-home message. And I think that also speaks to the sort of larger issue with nutrition research in general, which is that most of it is very short-term. It doesn't look at long-term effects. And in fact, especially with weight loss research, there's a huge recidivism rate. There's lots of articles, lots of studies will say, look at this 6-week program. People lost this much weight and they kept it off. And it's like, yeah, for 6 weeks, they kept it off. Awesome. Or a year, they kept it off. Sure. But, what are we talking about 5 years from now, right? 10 years from now? Like that's where the research really doesn't show any long-term effectiveness, and pretty much all, the vast majority of diets end up not having those results bear out over time.
Yeah, absolutely. I could not agree more.
And that sort of gets into, actually, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about this idea of just digestive health in general and dealing with digestive disorders from a nutritional standpoint, or what we call as dietitians, medical nutrition therapy, versus, because, backstory to this is, like we've talked offline about how there's a bit of a backlash that's happening now in certain circles of dietitians to the idea of the anti-diet movement, and dietitians being like, I'm not an anti-diet dietitian because of X, Y, and Z, and being very offended by this idea of anti-diet dietitians. And one of the arguments that's often made there is, well, I put people on diets for medical necessity. And so how could I be anti-diet when I'm prescribing phenylalanine-free diet for someone with phenylketonuria, for example, or whatever, these very specific types of diseases that might require a certain type of change in eating habits. And so my take, as we were talking offline, and I posted something about this on my Instagram recently, was that medical nutrition therapy, MNT, is different from diets. And anti-diet does not mean anti-MNT. And diet culture has actually, the term diet even comes out of this very moralized place. I'm writing about this in my book, so I can't go into all the detail here, but it's super fascinating history to the idea of a diet in the first place. And it's very tied up with moralized ideas about food and health, and also weight stigma. And so to use the word diet, to me, is just super problematic. And it's also very triggering to anyone who's had issues with weight stigma and dieting in the past. And so saying anti-diet dietitian, to me, is sort of a way of setting ourselves apart from diet culture and saying yeah, the word diet is in the name of my profession and that sucks, but let me put a little caveat at the beginning that I'm actually not that kind of dietitian. I'm an anti-diet dietitian, versus we can be anti-diet dietitians and still do medical nutrition therapy, because that's a different thing, right? And so when it comes to digestive disorders, like the stuff you were talking about with medical nutrition therapy, where there are lots of other, not things that involve an elimination diet, but some other things that you can do to help your digestion, right? Including taking away gum or diet foods, or removing things that might actually be harming you that are also tied up with diet culture. That's a great example, I think, of anti-diet MNT at work.
Yeah, it was so interesting. I was aware, but not really involved in kind of the conversation. Things I know, got heated a little bit on social media, or maybe heated a lot for certain people, about this conversation around what it means to be an anti-diet dietitian. And I don't want to say this in a flippant way, so I really want to be thoughtful about, how I engage in this conversation. But there was a part of me that thought, really? we have to sort of put this disclaimer out that we are on board with utilizing medical nutrition therapy for folks who have a medical diagnosis. Like, I did not realize that was being called into question. We operate in a culture where you stop most people on the street and talk about diet or dieting, and it has a particular connotation that we're speaking to, right? This idea of following a plan, usually to lose weight. Now, it's gotten a little bit trickier over the years as that's become less popular.
Yeah, now it's the wellness diet and like the orthorexic sort of mindset.
Exactly. And we've got, Weight Watchers rebranding and all sorts of things that we're dealing with, right? That it sort of can be a little bit more like a wolf in sheep's clothing. But in general, we kind of know I thought we all kind of knew what we mean when we said anti-diet, but I'm happy to take the time and make that clarification that you made so well to say, do I want my clients with real medical conditions to be thought about, to be cared for me to use what are like my 2 academic degrees to parse out and be thoughtful about how might food play a role here? 100%. But when it comes particularly to a lot of digestive stuff, what happens is, and I kind of think about this like a pie chart, is that for a lot of people, the pie chart of how to address, like, what are the tools in our toolbox to address these digestive issues, there is one element in that pie chart, and it is eliminating food. And in reality, we can draw that pie chart with many, many, many more tools. And if we're relying on a singular tool, which is taking foods out, that is really problematic. That means we have folks who are following a FODMAP diet, for instance, and because that's the only tool they're using, they're taking out all of that food, misusing the diet as it's intended to be used, and then actually seeing that there are problematic negative consequences to your body over a long period of time, relying on such a limited variety of foods. I mean, my good friend, Kate Scarlatta, who is renowned for her work in the field of IBS and FODMAPs, speaks very, very clearly. This diet is not to be meant to be followed for life. This is temporary. This is to help us tease out what's happening in the body. But because folks often rely solely on this single tool, get really, really confused on how to use it. And because it gets warped within diet culture, it's sort of this agreement like, oh no, I'm doing this for my gut. And in reality, it gets pulled in tandem with these other wishes as sort of this kind of stamp of approval to follow this very, very limited diet. And even a lot of these tools become very, very misused. So we get so skewed in our approach to working with digestive disorders because the lens becomes solely focused on this elimination protocol.
So good. So important to point that out. And I think especially this idea that like it's not meant to be used long term. It's supposed to be a short-term intervention that is in certain cases. And I have actually seen too in some of the research coming out recently out of Australia, there's a number of researchers there who are really specialized in FODMAPs. And I think Peter Gibson is his name, one of the leading researchers on FODMAPs, has started now writing and speaking about disordered eating as one of the potential complications of following this diet, which I think is so amazing and so needed because unfortunately, before he started doing that, I think a lot of gastroenterologists were getting a hold of this information about how the FODMAP diet could potentially be effective with IBS in some cases and just willy-nilly prescribing it to their IBS patients without doing the work of determining, is this person okay in their relationship with food? Is this gonna exacerbate their disordered eating that might already be driving their IBS? Or are they at risk for disordered eating even if they don't have it already? Are they at risk for it based on, their anxiety, their depression, their relationship with food already? And is there something else I can do instead of prescribing them an elimination diet?
Yeah.
So I think it's so important and great that some of these experts are now speaking out about the potential pitfalls of it too.
It's exactly right. I have been really, really pleased to see, I think, some of the researchers as well as practitioners who really specialize in digestive disorders speak out about this and to be really, really clear about how this is intended to be used and how it can be used appropriately. And I think that they can speak with almost a degree of sort of clout because their specialty is coming from this place of digestive disorders. And I think sometimes, people can feel like, oh, these paranoid people who work in eating disorders, they think everybody has an eating disorder.
Right.
And so I'm always appreciative of my colleagues in sort of related fields. One of the things that I thought was really interesting that I learned from Lauren, my collaboration from her, is that she was really coming at it from this lens of being a digestive health dietitian. And I said, how often do you use that full protocol of FODMAPs? And she said, rarely. She says, I rarely use it. She said, because usually we can get to the bottom of what foods certain people may be sensitive to, or they might not be digesting well, or they may have an intolerance to, without having to do the full-blown protocol. So she said, I rarely do it. And that was really instructive to me as someone outside of the field of eating disorders who maybe has less of a sort of sensitive reaction to these extreme elimination diets, is that she has been very invested in using lots of tools, whether it's being thoughtful about doing, with the help of someone looking at patterns of when your symptoms arise most in the context of the foods that you're eating, how they're being prepared, what your mood is, how your emotional well-being is in the context of other supplements, in the context of other things that we've mentioned earlier, things that you're drinking, gum that you're chewing, diet food.
Disorder behaviors.
Yes, behaviors, high volume intake when it comes to fiber. And so putting those things all in context and also considering, well, is this connected perhaps to medications that I'm taking? It's very, very common for medications that are used for the treatment of depression and anxiety is that they actually have targets that live within the gut, right? That we know that neurotransmitters, we have more serotonin being produced in our gut than we do in our brain. So those medications actually target the gut. So it's very, very common for side effects to be present in the context of medication or certain supplements. We know that calcium and iron are very, very constipating. And so, getting on this sort of bandwagon of taking all of these foods out can be really misguided when we haven't really considered a person's whole picture. I often say, like, taking out a bunch of food is never going to resolve the physiological effects of anxiety. If anything, it's going to make it worse. And so are we getting misguided here and sort of focusing in one area where we need to hold the big picture in place? One other thing that I'll just add is that what can be really compelling or interesting under a microscope and purely on a physiological level can be extraordinarily problematic when we don't consider the fact that we are human beings with thoughts and feelings that have responses to the behaviors that we engage in. And this is where, I kind of have feelings about things like intermittent fasting or very low calorie diets for things like longevity. I'm like, well, that may be really interesting in a rodent or under a microscope, but we are human beings who our behavior interplays with our emotional world and our cognitive world. And so what might be compelling at a cellular level becomes kind of irrelevant as a human who's in relationships and going to birthday parties and, goes out to dinner and goes to the grocery store, has limited time and resources for purchasing food and preparing meals. And so I think that we can get really, really hijacked into these conversations where we get kind of missing the forest for the trees.
Oh, God, so true. And I think that speaks to this idea that so-called holistic health, as it's currently packaged and sold in diet culture, is just physical health. Like, it's only looking at the physical. It's only looking at one aspect of health. It's not holistic at all. And to be truly holistic about health, we need to consider all of those other elements and the fact that people live in a human world with human connections and human feelings. And we aren't just rodents in a lab. Our lives are not solely directed towards maximizing our time on this planet. They're also directed towards maximizing the quality of that time on this planet. And sometimes those things are not in a laboratory setting, might be in conflict. But as human beings, we have to let the one win out that actually affects our lives. We have to actually let the quality of our lives win out.
I could not agree more. One of the things I advocate when possible, and I realize this isn't always possible, so I really want to be sensitive to that, is that when possible with my clients, I try to help them receive as much testing as they can in terms of assessing what is happening in their body. So as I was kind of combing through this research, I learned about things related to pelvic floor dysfunction that I had never known about, where primary symptoms are things like pain, as well as constipation, going to the bathroom irregularly, and bloating. And a lot of times, people talk about bloating and it's sort of feeling very uncomfortable, and they want to go immediately to removing foods that are going to make them bloat. Well, in the case of certain pelvic floor disorders, there is no diet that is going to touch the reality of this is a physiological thing that is happening as a result of your anatomy. And the treatment for that is not a gluten-free diet or take out dairy. The treatment for that is actually physical therapy. And so sometimes we can go down these rabbit holes because we think our only option is to change food. Now, sometimes making some dietary modifications can be immensely helpful. I'm not here disregarding it outright, of course not. But when we think that that's the only solution, we can get off track. And so utilizing and advocating with our primary care doctors, trying to get referrals when possible to see gastroenterologists. And I know that this can be complicated, but getting some actual testing done to the places in your body where you are having symptoms can be very revealing and very guiding to be able to rule things out or help you to find treatments that are going to be much more connected to the symptoms that you're having, rather than this just sort of blanket that I see all the time recommendation is take out gluten and dairy, take out sugar. And it's like, well, hold on a minute. Let's sort of back up here and see if we can get a better picture, a more fleshed out picture of what's actually happening.
Oh, that's so important to keep in mind. So I think of, in terms of digestive health, I think of dietary modifications or doing an elimination diet or taking things off of people's menu or whatever. I think of that as kind of the last resort, that actually comes with a lot of the point that Alan Levinovitz made in our episode 94, that the dietary modification has a lot of side effects, has a lot of potential side effects, and that sometimes the side effects of that are actually outweigh the side effects of medication, that it would actually be potentially less harmful to your health to go on some kind of medication than it would be to go taking a bunch of foods out of your diet or hacking, doing different things to your eating. And I think in terms of digestive health, like you said, that the sort of primary tool in the toolbox that everyone's using right now is take these foods out of your diet. Gluten and dairy are the devil. It's like that's the number one thing that everybody's jumping to. But actually, I think that should be the number umpteenth thing everybody's jumping to once these other interventions have been tried, other testing has been done, like things that, where we could potentially save someone from the assault to their relationship with food that going on an elimination diet would bring. And so leaving that as the last resort, just like some sort of very powerful medication with a ton of side effects, would be a last resort.
Right. And one of the things that I talk with my clients about, this is going to sound really simplistic, is that I bring it back to the need for our body, particularly for those of us who tend to be a bit more sensitive, more feeling. The more feeling we tend to be, not just emotionally, tends to be true sort of in terms of what we experience in our bodies. So we tend to be more vulnerable to things like irritable bowel syndrome. So if we fall under that, I guess, kind of camp, or thinking about sort of, gosh, I kind of hit all these different markers and I kind of have my hand raised, is that we tend to need a lot of consistency to do well in general. So that means consistency with sleep patterns, consistency with the time we go to bed, but that's also true in terms of consistency with how we nourish our bodies. And so we tend to feel better when we are really making sure that we're very consistent, that every few hours we're having something balanced to eat, right? And that for more sensitive systems, occasionally having breakfast, going long stretches of time without eating, then maybe having a really large meal, and having this really sort of chaotic, unpredictable eating pattern or eating in an inadequate way is going to be a setup for having pretty significant symptoms within your digestion. So that's one of the first places that I start, is I do this education and say our bowels thrive on consistency. There is what's called it's related to our nervous system. It's called the migrating motor complex. And the way that it functions in our body in terms of producing normal bowel movements is that it relies on our eating in a consistent way. And that doesn't mean we eat the exact same thing at the exact same time every single day, but it means, do you get balanced, adequate intake in a dependable way that your body can count on? And when that is happening, our nervous system functions much more normally and it functions in a more predictable way. But when we're chaotic, we're going on a diet, off a diet, we're trying intermittent fasting, and then we're doing paleo, and then we've gone off gluten, and you're wondering why you're having digestive symptoms, it is no wonder. Our bodies really thrive on that dependability. And it's almost a retraining of the digestive system that has to happen in order for it to operate in a way that is more smooth.
Oh, I so identify with that. I mean, I've been raising my hand every time you've been describing the characteristics of people who tend to have IBS and have eating disorders and anxiety and all this stuff. And, I'm very much someone who's highly sensitive to any sort of changes like that. And I have noticed, so, I had IBS for years when I had my eating disorder, and it was all very chaotic. My eating was much like you described, on a diet, off a diet, doing gluten, not doing gluten, going hours and hours without eating, and then binging and all of the stuff, right? And since having that stop, I have found a remarkable consistency in my digestion, a remarkable level of being pain-free pretty much all the time and being symptom-free pretty much all the time. But the times when symptoms will flare up will be like if I have to get up at 4 a.m. for a flight, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Every time, inevitably, I'll be nauseous. I'll have constipation. I'll have digestive symptoms will arise. I'll be very gassy as well. I'm fun. I'm fun to fly with.
We'd make quite the pair, Christy.
Oh yeah. So that's one thing, or if I'm super stressed and I have a lot of deadlines and stuff, I'll notice reflux starts happening more, especially, if I'm eating in a more chaotic way because I'm stressed and I'm like, oh, let me just work a little bit more before I make dinner or whatever. It's that consistency really does have a huge effect on my digestion. I've noticed that as one of the key things to just maintaining a sense of ease and balance. And of course, you can't always control it, right? Because sometimes you do have to take an early flight in the morning and get up at 4 a.m. Or sometimes you do have a lot of work on your plate, and that's what it is, But I think just recognizing those other triggers for IBS and those other ways that digestive disorders can be affected is really helpful, so that now I'm so far out anyway, and so into the anti-diet world that I don't think I could be triggered back into let me just do this cleanse or whatever. But I'm preventing myself from slipping down that road just by recognizing I know what these triggers are, and I know that the solution is just, okay, I'm going to have to just get some sleep. I'm going to have to just adjust to this new place that I'm flying to and try to eat consistently while I'm there. I'm going to have to try to not overwork myself so much once I'm done with this deadline, and let me figure out how to take some time off, just allowing for those sorts of triggers to be there and finding lifestyle ways. And I'm not talking about diety lifestyle, I'm not talking about a lifestyle change, but just ways of changing behaviors that can help account for these other triggers that have nothing to do with what I eat.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I could not agree more. And especially in terms of what you were saying, how do you engage just in the day-to-day with your life, right? And one of the things that I will often say to my clients is a stressed out person is likely to have a stressed out gut. And it can be, of course, I am a human being. I am often overly stressed. My anxiety levels, I'm often operating at higher than I'd like them to be. And what I know without a doubt is that when my anxiety levels are elevated to a certain point, I have really notable symptoms in my digestion. I have a stomach ache. I feel sick. I have more diarrhea. I have more gas and bloating. And so this idea of, I'm going to find this food and take it out, let's take just a couple steps back. Take a deep breath and say, can I look at the whole picture? What dieting behaviors or eating disorder behaviors, whatever you want to call them, still remain? Fake foods that I'm eating, gum that I'm chewing, too much caffeine, too much seltzer water, imbalanced meals, right? So that's one place to assess. Looking at how consistent and balanced am I with my eating? How predictable is my routine? Is my body guessing and not knowing when the next meal is going to come? Is my eating from one week looking so radically different from the other week? Well, that's one thing where you can look. And then this other place, am I trying to engage in techniques that help to just take my system down a couple notches? If I'm someone who tends to kind of ruminate in my thinking or get really sort of clenched tight or really, really anxious, are you taking time to think about how do I settle my body down, whether it's using a guided meditation or deep breathing or relaxation or using essential oils, anything that helps to just sort of bring those levels down to your baseline. And a lot of people feel like, I don't have the time for that. Well, that is a part of the puzzle. And only focusing on removing foods over time, for most people, maybe not for everyone, but for most people, elevates that stress response. Thinking about, am I getting variety in terms of the things that I'm eating? Am I nourishing my body in a way that is not just considering my physiological health, but is also considering my mental and emotional well-being? Am I holding myself as a whole person rather than a science experiment under a microscope? So those are the things that I encourage my clients to think about, to sort of pause, step back, and try to really scan a wide lens. And I guess the last thing that I would mention is that one of the things that we didn't have time to touch on today is that there is a correlation between negative body image, not just for folks with, disordered eating, or let's be honest, right, walking through this world, but also specific body image challenges for people who have digestive issues. And as you work to develop greater body trust and to see yourself in this way that is much more balanced and I think much more complete, I stay away from the word holistic because I think it's a problematic one, actually can sort of added benefit help us to be more calm in terms of our self-image and in terms of our body image as well.
That is so important. And I think that's a great note to end on. I could talk to you forever about this stuff. It's so fascinating. So thank you for sharing all your wisdom and your expertise. This has been a fascinating conversation. And tell us where people can find you and learn more about the courses that you're doing, especially this upcoming digestive health course.
Oh, well, thank you so much for inviting me in for this conversation, Christy. It just would have been a lot more fun had I come to visit you in Brooklyn.
I know. Next time.
Next time. But I really hope that some of this information may have resonated or felt helpful for folks. I'll be interested to know. And I love engaging with people on social media. So I'm fairly easy to find. All of my social media handles are MarciRD, which is MarciRD. So my website's marcird.com, and that's where I'll be posting information, of course, on social media as well when these courses go live. I'm not sure when this interview is going to be posted and where that's going to be in relationship, but our goal is to have this course go live this winter 2018. So it should be coming out soon. And it's really going to be this work between both Lauren and I, where she's bringing in a lot more information than what we covered today in terms of actually the details of treating a lot of these complaints and digestive issues, and bringing in kind of this big picture of how do we help without harming. So I look forward to connecting with folks online. And thanks again for the great conversation.
Thank you so much, Marci. It's a pleasure talking with you as always. So that's our show. Thanks again so much to Marci Evans for joining us on this episode, and thanks to you for listening. If you're looking for some practical tips to get started on your own anti-diet journey, grab my free audio guide, 7 Simple Strategies for Finding Peace and Freedom with Food. Just go to christyharrison.com/strategies to get it. That's christyharrison.com/strategies. If you've gotten something out of this podcast, please help us reach more people who need to hear the anti-diet message by subscribing, sharing, and giving us good reviews. You can subscribe to all the different platforms we're on at christyharrison.com/subscribe. That's christyharrison.com/subscribe. To get full show notes from this episode, including all the resources we mentioned, plus a full transcript, head over to christyharrison.com/175. That's christyharrison.com/175. And to get the transcript, just scroll down to the bottom of the page and enter your email address. This episode was brought to you by Poshmark. Poshmark is the easiest way to buy and sell fashion items. Download the free Poshmark app to score amazing deals from tons of brands, or list your own items to get those triggering clothes out of your closet and make some cash. Shipping is fast and easy, and it's all handled directly through the app. Today, you can get $5 off your first purchase when you enter the invite code FOODPSYCH, that's FOODPSYCH, when you sign up. A big thanks to our editor and engineer, Mike Lalonde, and to my Food Psych programs team, including our community and content associate, Vinci Chue, our administrative assistant, Julianne Watasik, and our transcript assistant, Megan Saichi, who's sadly going to be moving on after this episode, and we're going to have another great transcript assistant starting next time. But I want to thank Megan for all her amazing service to the podcast, and she will be missed. Our theme song was written and performed by Carolyn Pennypacker Riggs, and I'm your host and producer, Christy Harrison. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, stay psyched.